it to that. You can't see. There you go. I hope everyone can see that. So we're going to talk about meadows. There was a few questions that I posed at the beginning, which were, have we really lost 97% of our grasslands? We quite often hear that quoted, and where has that come from? Why has it happened if that is the case, and how do we recreate lost grasslands, and why do we, if they don't really fit with our agricultural systems of today, and how and where should we do this? So there's a few questions there that hopefully I can start to answer during the course of this talk. Right, let's get into it. I will be just using a few notes just to remind me of a few points. So where do you start with any of these things? Well, a definition of meadow is always useful. So all the main dictionaries refer to a field, which is an interesting place to start. They usually look at a field with grass. Some of them look at wildflowers and some look at hay. It's interesting then that the more recent online dictionary definitions use land or tract of grassland. And really that's the reason that's interesting is it depends what time period you're looking at this. In the modern era, then definitely field is probably relevant, but going back through history that becomes less relevant, and so hopefully we can explore that a bit now. Okay, go right back to pre-humans. And what does the landscape look like? Well, I think probably a lot of you are familiar with the different arguments over whether there's a dense wildwood as proposed by Oliver Rackham, or whether there's a dynamic mosaic of landscapes as proposed by Franz Vera. I suspect it's probably a mix of the two. You know, it doesn't make sense that one or the other is the outright winner, and especially in somewhere like Devon where we've got such a diverse mix of landscapes. We know that obviously there are natural inhibitors to woodland growth and climax vegetation growth. So things like wind, salt. What else have we got? We've got flood. You could even argue we've got fire in some cases, especially around gorse and things of that sort. But obviously one of the main natural inhibitors is grazing. And with wild herbivores, especially where there would have been historically predators moving them around and condensing them, they would have definitely kept areas open in prehistory. And we know from looking at livestock at the minute that they'll generally settle on level areas. So where there's hills, ridges, plateaus, or valley basins, coastal floodplains, river floodplains, those sorts of places, that's where you're likely to end up with larger open areas. And obviously also a mix of open habitats just in scattered pathways and small glades. So what do those open areas look like in prehistory? Well, they probably don't look like what a lot of our grasslands look like now, although they bear some similarities to some of them. The main ones probably to look at in a Devon context, and it's all dependent on geology and soils, wetness, those fundamental things. We all know about wetness in the West Country. So where you've got acid soils, then you're likely to get heathlands or acid grassland. The difference between the two is likely to be how draining it is, and also how nutrient poor it is. Where you're on limestones and the likes, which you've got quite a band of through Devon, then you might get some limestone, calcareous grassland. These would probably be in downs and the likes, and so sort of up on the tops, on the coastal areas, and sort of exposed places like that. Obviously in Devon we've got, if you're looking at our bottom left picture there, we've got also the culm grasslands. These are on very acid and wet ground, and with high rainfall you're likely to get wet heaths, and obviously the culm grassland that we all know in those areas, and also you get more neutral grassland in the floodplains. This would have been, these are richer, so most of this landscape would have been very nutrient poor, but in the floodplains would have been much richer, and because of the alluvial soils they're likely to be more neutral, but not quite to the level that the neutral grassland that we think of these days. Nothing here would have looked much like our traditional meadows, although there would have been little patches of that in our landscape. I'll come on to that in a minute. Okay, right, here we are. Neolithic people have arrived. Hooray! So we might start to understand, what this looks like. We're looking at about 6,000 years ago. They're starting to bring domestic animals, domesticated cattle in from the continent. At that point, that's when the natural grasslands start to change. We're starting to get some alteration to the grasslands. The open areas which would have been exploited as hunting areas by Mesolithic and Paleolithic peoples would now be exploited more for herding, and they would have probably been expanded and opened up. Obviously, as settlements arrived, you're getting arable land cut out of that area as well. And really that pattern carries on into through the Bronze Age and into Roman times. You've lost most of the woodland at that point, and actually our grassland levels are almost getting as high as they will get at this point. So they're the natural grasslands, they're not really that altered, maybe some slight alteration from increased grazing, but broadly quite a natural system, but expanded because of woodland clearance. Okay, so let me just find my notes. So then we go on to the early medieval times. Now, obviously, here we get a massive increase in settlements, and therefore the arable take that comes out of those downlands and the likes as well, but also pasture take coming out of there. The medieval time is a time of feudal land management, where people don't tend to own the land. The king or a lord owns the land, and everyone else pays rents or tithes to that lord. And so there's a driver there to be productive. You're not just subsistence farming anymore, you're also having to pay the rent for your land. And that's quite a big driver of change, and it means that people have to produce more than they can just survive on. That drives big changes in terms of the land immediately around settlements. You start to get, as this picture shows, hay cuts and things of that sort so that you can winter graze. You start to get the beginning of folding, where livestock are put out onto higher areas or further away from settlements and then brought back into dung on the grassland. And that's really where you start to see the development of what we would recognise as lowland meadows these days, as farmyard manure and dunging is going on land around settlements. That's the first really big change, but also the grazing of the higher land through there would have been kept as common even by those lords and the king and the likes. It would have been retained for the whole settlement, but also sometimes multiple settlements, and probably would have had an increase of grazing. So you're starting to see that natural grassland now start to alter through increased grazing pressure and slight nutrient enrichment from that. And these would have remained as downlands and wastes, but they would have been altering slightly from their natural state. It's a shame you can't quite see the top of that picture, but okay, moving through into the late medieval times, we're at a point where very feudal. There's lots of rent being demanded. There's a big increase in settlements. Obviously, we've gone through plague, Black Death at various points through this period, and that has crashes, but you also get booms in population, and that drives new settlements, new farming areas. The dissolution of the monasteries in 1530s also changes land ownership hugely, because Catholic Church and especially monasteries in Devon, a lot of the country, own a huge amount of land. As this is taken off, and actually lots of areas in Devon and elsewhere foresaw this, and people would, corporations of towns, the local gentry, landed gentry or whatever, would have taken some of that land back from monasteries over the time prior to dissolution, and that starts to become effectively more private than it had been. It had been managed very much as common land, and so now you start to see a slight change in the attitude towards land. We still get open areas. So I chose this picture, which is why I was hoping you could see the top of it. I don't know how easy you can see the top of it, because you can see the difference in the field patterns here. The top ground up there, which you can see by the very large fields and the very straight line across the top, is it is retained as open land for much later. Those big fields come in much later on. in the times of in late medieval times, these would have been open pastures, open downland, and some heathland. And really, the middle area of this picture and lower area of this picture would have been where the fields would have been. As land is enclosed and it's starting to be pinched off during this time, then it gets easier and easier to apply farmyard manure, to start changing it, to start adding other nutrients, things like seaweed and shingle and the likes, to start to bring up the pH, so it's a slightly more neutral grassland. And so we're starting to see the change from the very acid downlands that are characteristic of a lot of Devon to becoming more neutral. So we've gone through the early times of human settlement in this part of the world, and we've gone from a time when we've got a naturalistic state of the of grasslands in a woodland matrix. We don't exactly know how much that was, but let's say it was there. We've certainly gone up. We've lost a lot of woodland, and we've gone to quite a still naturalistic grasslands, but probably near natural grasslands. But now we're going rapidly down again in the amount of grassland being available and out there, and it's also starting to change. So we're getting still nearly natural grasslands up on the ridges, but we've got now more what we describe as semi-natural grassland in the enclosed areas. So moving forwards again, we're now into agricultural revolution. There's different dates for this, but sort of let's take it from the 1650s onwards. You're getting quite a big change. And this is where, if you read someone like Radcliffe, he talks about the dramatic loss of grasslands from the 1700 onwards. And that really is that loss of downlands and heathlands and the likes. And the reason for this is that agriculture becomes much more productive. Technology is moving forwards. Things like field rotations, crop rotations, so the Norfolk four-field rotation, where winter crops start coming in, mean that it's much more efficient and effective to take land and make it arable. Previously, it was sort of borderline whether you could get anything out of it for a lot of the year. So actually now you're in a very productive landscape. It makes sense to take land from the downlands, and so that's what happens. You've also got a massive increase in liming, and you see this sort of proliferation of these lime kilns that dot our landscape all over. As canals and shipping are able to move these materials around, and they're being used very widespread on the acid soils of Devon. With obviously some other things, like I said, about seaweed and shingle and sand and the likes. So we've got now with the lime, with manure, we've got a massive increase of lowland meadows where pastures do are retained. We still have some high areas that, especially where they are, where it doesn't make sense to convert them. They're a long way from settlements, and maybe they're very rough ground. Some of them then actually start getting planted up instead. So you do see a loss of those grasslands through planting up of woodlands onto them. Through the Industrial Revolution, obviously, technology takes hold and labour moves away. So we get a big change then in terms of how we manage the landscape and how we manage grasslands. The feudal system is also diminishing, and so there's sort of appetite for putting technology, and by technology I don't just mean like machines like this, but also the application of sort of different types of fertilizers that can start to go onto ground, and leading to very altered grasslands. So I thought I'd just use a bit of an example from near where I live. I'm from South Devon, and this is from a patch. The red dot there is near Blackawton in South Devon. And I've just looked at the tithe map, which is a really good, tells a good story about the history. You can see in black here, I've written on, the tithe map comes in a map and the apportionments, which is all the information associated with the map. And when you look at this, I've just taken in black the field names, and in orange the land use at the time. This was an attempt by government to understand all the different tithes that were paid to churches and local lords and gentry around the country as tax laws were changing. So if I look at that now, this is looking at the field names, and the reason I highlight the field names is because field names are quite often associated with earlier land use. And you can see here that in yellow, I've got the heathland. So a lot of these field names are heath or Heathfield, Heath Plantation, Peas Heath, those sorts of names. And it denotes that quite obviously this high ridge was a heathland. Around this in the light green is a lot of downland, also a load of fields called something park, which is quite often a name for a down or for a scrubbier area. The dark green is copses, firs, brakes, and woodland, all different types of woodland, some more managed than others. And the only bits of arable really that I've picked out here are these small strips. The long strip there is called Red Hills. A lot of those fields are called Red Hills, and that quite often in Devon denotes where soil was exposed, and it was known for it. The other one was Croft, and crofting quite often refers to where arable land is involved. I haven't actually picked out the areas around the settlements at the bottom of this picture, but partly because their field names don't associate with land use, but they would have almost certainly been a mix of arable and temporary pasture. Coming on to the land use in 1840 when this map was made, suddenly you see a dramatic change. So while the previous map was probably referring to land use over the previous 500 years, it could be in for 100 years, but probably more likely over many hundreds of years. This is now a snapshot from 1840 of what the land use was. And quite clearly, we've moved to the brown is arable, and it shows that we've got now a very arable landscape. The loss of grassland is really noticeable as well. So we've lost our heathland, we've lost most of our downland. The remaining bits here are mostly referred to as pasture, meadow, or field. And there aren't so many that are down as down or anything else like that. There's still bits of woodland. And I just thought I'd put in there the current situation on that same piece of land, just as a sort of comparison really, is to show you that now we've still got some this light green is modern grasslands. While there's a reasonable patch of grassland there, none of this is species-rich grassland. This is all improved, and you don't see any remnants. The nearest remnants you're likely to find is actually where there are patches within the woodlands or in small corners. This is quite a lot of amenity grassland around the settlements now. The dark green is still there as woodlands, and it's noticeable that woodlands come and go from fields. But nearly the whole of the rest of this image is arable land. And that's a pattern that you see across the county in large parts of the lowlands. I've highlighted there in blue that we've also got a solar farm there. That's an interesting thing, because obviously that could be an opportunity for grassland restoration, although I know that's contentious. I won't go into that too much now. Okay, so one of the questions was, have we lost 97% of the lowland grasslands since World War II? Well, in short, yes. This paper here is the one that's often quoted. Fuller's paper it's a review of grassland surveys between 1930 and 1984, and quite clearly it does pick that up. But obviously, it's a snapshot. We lost 97% of the species-rich lowland grasslands from 1930. Those that were left at 1930. And just to show you a bit more of that, the detail of that. So please forgive me for butchering Fuller's own graphs in this, but hopefully it just makes it a bit clearer. The interesting thing here is the 97% is down at the bottom here. The yellow line is loss of unimproved permanent pasture, which is taken to mean species rich. But the interesting things here is there's also a 40% loss of total grassland. So much land is going over to arable in this time. And that's linked to this increase in permanent pasture, which is 700% increase in permanent pasture. And that's the reason that's interesting is partly because another piece of another graph from Fuller's work shows the percentage of permanent pasture fields that are outside of arable rotations that are receiving fertilizer. And what this means is that any remnant pasture land that would have traditionally been at least moderately species rich is now really changing in its makeup. In about 1930, effectively, there was no application of fertilizer to those lands outside the arable rotation. It just wasn't perceived as worthwhile to fertilize ground outside of them. By 1985, 85% of pasture outside the arable rotation is fertilized. And obviously that's to do with economics of that, the cheapness of fertilizer, how easy it is to apply. Instead of farmyard manure and carts, it's now, a big tractor with a, sort of just spreading it very quickly on the field. I should say that decline in grasslands is not just about fertilizer, though. It's also about drainage and the plough. And obviously, in the time that we're talking about, you've gone from a period of horse-drawn carts and very few tractors and very little technology in the majority of farms. You've gone to a period where all these things are very available, and with organic fertilizers on top, inorganic fertilizers on top, that's a massive change in our landscape. So that's our history side almost complete. So yes, we have lost 97% of our grassland, but only since 1930. And actually, you could argue that we've lost an awful lot more since the agricultural revolution, and even more since the very peak of grasslands in the countryside. Whether you'd want to go back to that sort of level, and whether it would be practical, it probably never would be practical to do that. But what you could look at going back to is somewhere in between natural state and 97%, that original 1930s amount. So we need to think about where we want to end up. Now, I was just going to talk quickly here about some drivers of those changes, because it's important in considering where we're going in the future. So the main drivers for change in our grasslands has been agricultural productivity. It always has been. Produce more food, originally to produce it for subsistence, but very quickly with the feudal system and then in modern agriculture to produce sales from and income and therefore profit, really. And obviously, as you have moved from subsistence to being able to sell produce, that's enabled specialisms in farming, reduction in mixed farming, and also the take of arable, the take for vegetables and things of that sort, and therefore the loss of grasslands, and especially semi-natural grasslands. So that has been the single biggest driver. And of course, a lot of it is related to being able to pay your rent or being able to get income or profit. A couple of other drivers I just wanted to flag up. I've already mentioned rents. The feudal system in the UK really drove a lot of this change in agriculture and the attitudes towards grasslands and farming. It wasn't seen as just something you did to survive. You had to more than survive, and that really forced those changes. The agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, a lot of it driven by this need to produce more than you need, and so. With that, the take of arable again and the loss of grasslands right back to the end of the Roman period and the likes, that was the case. I mentioned about especially in the 19th century, up until then, the agriculture was a labour-intensive sector. And even from the 19th century, it's labour dependent, I guess. So as labour requirements changed after the end of during the Industrial Revolution, obviously that was led by technological change in the cities and people moving to go to the cities, but also that helped to drive more technological change because of the need now that people had lost their labour source. And obviously labour really came to an end as a large-scale thing in the First World War, but it had been diminishing over the previous century and a half or so. And of course, that meant a change to agriculture. It meant a change to the way we graze. There was changes in breeds and varieties of seeds used and things of that sort. And we start to see a whole raft of changes because of labour changes. The last one I was just going to raise from this is obviously the one that probably most people think of, which is technology. Technology has been changing throughout the centuries and driven by agricultural productivity and the likes. But for most of that time, millennia, the change was very small, and so you got relatively little impact on the grasslands. They went from a natural state to a near natural state to a semi-natural state, but they broadly kept a lot of species in there, even if it was in a different format. As technology really ramped up from the agricultural revolution forwards, you got those new breeds, you got new varieties, and also even in the grasslands, you started seeing things like ryegrass, different grasses, clovers being brought in. That's all agricultural technology changing, and obviously then we go on to the tractors, the plough, drainage, and fertilizer are the big changes, but it's all driven by agricultural technology, agricultural productivity. Right, so that's the bad news. We've lost loads of grassland. I think we probably mostly knew that, but it's interesting to just see the context of where that came. Things haven't looked great, and those drivers are still there. There is still the driver for more agricultural productivity, for more profit, for paying rents and paying the bills, paying loans, and the technology is still driving change forwards. So those aren't like change, but we are in a way not fortunate in one sense, but fortunate in another sense that we have got some other drivers, and this hopefully will change things going forwards. So we've got a set of new drivers that even in the last 2-3 years have really come to light, but properly probably in the last 5 to 10 years they've been coming to light, and those are around climate emergency, the linked biodiversity emergency, and obviously related to that, the health emergency, obesity and things of that sort. Now, all these are tied together quite strongly, and obviously we're seeing a collapse in species. The State of Nature report, picks out the huge collapses in species and the risks of extinction that we've got, and we really do sit on the brink of a mass extinction. And that's just at the point when we're realizing that a lot of the answers to these questions come from the natural world and about the value of nature in tackling these other emergencies. So what values can we get from grasslands? Well, obviously there's still a food value. Grazing them and producing food, meat and milk comes in. So that's obviously still valuable. But critically, there are other values here. Carbon, there's a lot of work done. Some of my colleagues have done work on the value of carbon storage in grasslands. That's depending on the way that the grassland's managed. You can sequester huge amounts of carbon in the soils under grasslands through the thatch that's developed, through deep rooting systems and the likes. I'll talk a bit more about biodiversity in a moment, but quite obviously, with 6,000 years of increased grasslands in our landscape, then biodiversity has become hugely reliant on a mix of grasslands and different grassland types, and a grassland in a diverse landscape. So quite clearly, they're critical for addressing the biodiversity emergency. Soils themselves, agriculture is getting to the point where, I forget what the figure is, but it's something like 60 summers or 60 crops left in East Anglian soils and the likes. Grasslands have a huge potential for restoring soils, and actually in the old rotations prior to the agricultural revolution, fallow land, which was leaving land effectively to regrass over, was a really critical part of restoring soils, and I think it can and should be in the future. Also, they have ability to filter water and to store water. A piece of work a colleague did on the North Devon Nature Improvement Area on looking at culm grassland produced this graph, which shows in the green line the amount of water that culm grassland stores, species-rich culm grassland stores through rainfall events, as compared on the purple line with improved pasture. And quite clearly, there's quite a significant difference in the storage capacity of the grassland there. When we're looking at increased flooding, increased rainfall, the flashier events coming forwards, then that's going to be really critical. Mentioned about biodiversity, we've got a huge range of biodiversity reliant on grassland. And the way they use grassland is very different. Some rely on a single patch of grassland for their entire existence, but many move between grasslands, and they might need them either directly connected, or if you're a more mobile species like the bats or birds of prey and some predators, you can move between grassland patches. But others, bumblebees, for example, are probably sort of around 250, 300 meters distance that they can travel between appropriate sites. But many of our insects do require, and small mammals do require, directly connected grasslands to be able to move around and thrive and stop them being vulnerable to loss. So there's a huge range of benefits to be had there that are beyond agriculture. I should just flag up one more, which is happy people. I mentioned about the health emergency there. One of the things certainly that's come out from the COVID crisis is the value that people place on the natural world. And many of the places that people are accessing are grasslands and pass through grasslands. And it's very, most people have access to some form of grassland, and being able to turn these to much more biodiverse sites, there's plenty of evidence out there suggesting that that will really help with health and well-being too. But all these benefits don't necessarily come from the current main type of grassland out there. So grasslands currently make up 37% of UK land area, but semi-natural grasslands only make up 1% of the UK land area. So the vast majority of them are this sort of thing: the ryegrasses, some of the common fescues, cocksfoot and timothy, and then common clovers and the likes. Now, these not only are unlikely to add huge amounts to contributing to tackling these other emergencies, these other drivers, but also they can lead to, in some situations, to increasing the losses and adding to those emergencies. So you can get carbon loss from these sorts of soils if they're not managed correctly. You get biodiversity loss and the likes. And obviously that's not as pleasant a place to walk for people, affecting their health and well-being. But they are productive landscapes, so it's about a balance. If we want to address those other drivers, then we need more of these sorts of grasslands, species diverse, perhaps within a structurally diverse system in whole landscapes. But I flag up whole landscapes here, but it could even be very small patches in our gardens, out on the road verge, out on the corner of your street, or wherever it is. These sorts of grasslands are the valuable ones. So just moving forwards then to restoration and where we might go with that. So I said that we've got 1% of our countryside that is species-rich grasslands. This is 100 squares, that is 1 square, so 1%. Now clearly, where do we start with that is quite a big challenge. We've got so little left that there's going to be a challenge to recreate sufficient to make a difference. But we have some advice from our good friend that many of you will have heard of, Professor John Lawton, that gives us advice on creating a range of different features through our landscape and using existing sites as core areas to spread this out. And we can do that by creating patches that are linked across our landscape, creating a set of core areas and other restoration areas where potentially there weren't any grasslands there before. But importantly, we need to link them up. So that different species can move through that landscape. Excuse me for a moment. We also need to think about the other benefits like the water quality and water storage benefits. So making sure that they're in the right places for those to be achieved across those landscapes. Of course, that's all very well, but that's still in a working landscape. So we need to think about how it fits with agriculture, where we can still get our productive land, and using maybe grasslands as a way of buffering agriculture, both for wildlife, but also for things like protecting water quality and the likes and flood. So they need to sit together, these things across our landscape. Creating a huge amount more grassland in our landscape is not going to be easy, or other habitats. And this is the role that something called the Nature Recovery Network is likely to come in to help us to decide where to prioritise our effort, our money, our time. We can all do a small patch on our doorstep, but if we want to really make big changes, that's going to take a huge amount of effort. And so to recover that sort of massive scale that we're talking that we've lost, then we need to know where to invest and know where we'll get the benefits. The map on the top shows the difference of if we add an additional 13% of land of species-rich habitat from the map on the left, which is our current existing habitat, to the map on the right. And it shows the huge amount on there just in buffering our existing site. But the way we do that, we've got places across the country that have done what's called ecological network mapping and opportunity mapping and things of that sort. And these light colours here are where new habitat might go in, while the reds and the oranges are where existing habitat is. And it's about linking up and getting the best benefit. So how do we actually do that? Well, we're fortunate in Devon Wildlife Trust that we've spent decades advising farmers, landowners on how to enhance their land and working at a landscape scale as well. So not just individual farmers, but whole networks across whole landscapes. But increasingly, we need to engage other audiences as well. So we need to look at, obviously, people like yourselves probably that are coming from different communities, both the landowning community and rural communities, but also urban communities, and getting people engaged in the idea of how can they recreate grasslands and other habitats across their landscapes and their local communities. And obviously in those areas, that's going to be critically important for that health and well-being agenda as well. So how do we do it? Okay, so the last section here, I just wanted to talk about exactly how you go about it, which might be what a traditional talk on meadows would have done. So the first thing I'd say is let it grow. We're all in a rush to create grassland or other habitats, and nearly always what we want to do is think about it one year and have a species-rich grassland by the next year. And realistically, that's not, while that might answer some challenges, like you could argue cracking on and getting carbon sorted or water quality sorted would be great, but actually knowing what's there first is really important. First of all, knowing what species are there. So if you let it grow over a season, you can see what's in there already, rather than what's being grazed down tight when it's very hard to see. But also then you can start to check your soils and see what sort of grassland would be appropriate. I've said throughout this that we've lost huge amounts of the original sort of acid grasslands of our landscape, and also calcareous grasslands over the limestone landscapes. But we've also lost huge amounts of the more recent Lowland Meadow as well. And so trying to find out which sort of grassland or other open habitat might be appropriate for land is really important, and understanding nutrient levels and things of that sort. If you've got high nutrients in there, you might take a couple of years of cutting grass and removing it to strip those nutrients out. We're in a very high, a very altered landscape with very high nutrients and a very different set of circumstances. You can't just go and throw seed on there and hope that it will work. So understanding your patch is really important. I should mention at this point that if you've got a very grass-dominated sward of grass, then of grassland, then you could also look at things like yellow rattle, which I'm sure many of you have come across if you're familiar with grassland management at all, which is a parasitic plant which helps to reduce. It feeds off the roots of grassland, mainly grass species, and helps to reduce the dominance of grass species in the sward. So that's another tactic to use. Once you know what you've got and you know where you're wanting to go, there's the next two phases. What you're in the season that you're looking at restoring your grassland, or maybe improving or enhancing your grassland, and it's time to cut it short. Nearly all of our native grassland seeds just sit on the surface, and they need contact with the soil. So you need to cut the grass very short. That could be done if you're a farmer or access to farming and you're doing it on a large scale. That could be using a big cutter collector or cutting and baling and removing the grass. You could graze it down tight if you've got access to livestock, but you could also, like this young lady, be out there and just mow it, collect it, and put that on your compost heap or whatever. Once you've done that, depending on how open the sward is and how open the soil is, you need to expose some soil. You can do it through things like harrowing. This is quite a robust method. I'd probably argue maybe too robust to expose a huge amount of soil. But you can just do a chain harrow or something of that sort, or the equivalent in a garden would be to rake through the sward just to remove some of the thatch or moss or whatever. And that helps that give the seed somewhere to come into contact with the soil. Once you've done that, you need to get some seed. Now, there's several ways of doing this. If you're fortunate enough that you've got a nice grassland nearby, you could look at something called green haying. This is where you take a hay cut from that nice grassland at a time when there's plenty of flower stems still in flower, but some just going to seed in there, and you have to choose the best time of year for the particular grassland you're choosing. And then collect that on the same day and take it to your site that you're wanting to restore. Now that comes with advantages. You get a huge variety of species in doing this way, but it's both labor intensive or machinery intensive if you're doing it on a big scale with the tractors. But also it takes a huge amount of preparation to have both the site where the seed's coming from, the donor site, and the site where it's going to, the receptor site, ready on the same day. So it can be very difficult to have all that done. But if you've got access to it, you can do it with volunteers like we did here in South Devon, or you can do it with huge machinery and bale choppers and all the rest of it, like we've done in the Calm Grassland over many years. Alternatively, you can look at seed. So if you've got a site nearby, you can harvest seed. Now, we do this on many of our projects through, we've got these towed seed harvesters, and they just literally go through with a big brush and sweep the seed out of the grassland, leaving, although it's flattened, it will come back after about 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on the weather. So it still leaves a crop for the farmer to take or to graze. But we managed to sweep the seeds out. We shake them through. Simon Berry shaking through the seed there on the bottom left. And then you can sort it and grade it and dry it and then bag it. Now, I would just flag up that if you are doing this on a large scale, you do need a license from DEFRA and through the Animal, Plant and Health Agency to be able to do this, which we have and use for our very large amount of grassland restoration works we do. But I would just say that while this is doing it on a big scale, you can do this on a very small scale too. If any of you've got a leaf blower, you can turn them the other way around so it sucks and just suck up small little bits from a road verge or from a little patch that you've got. And the advantage of that is they normally have blades in them. They scarify the seeds too, so it helps them to germinate. The alternative is, like I do all the time, is you can wander down the lanes, picking seed heads out and throwing them into your grass. But the alternative for those who don't have access to this sort of thing is to go out and buy some seeds. There are loads of seed mixes out here. I don't advocate any one of these, but there are many out there that you can use. I'd try and find one that uses native seed mixes, and preferably ones that sort of look more like native grassland mixes. And I would also try and avoid using very generic mixes. If you can find ones that seem to fit what you see out and about in your locality, that'd be really valuable. We're in danger of, if we do too much grassland recreation using generic mixes, we'll end up with not a very natural looking setup. In fact, it look more like a set of arable fields that have been planted with wildflowers. But once you've got your seed, go out and sow it. You can do that the old-fashioned way, scattering it onto the soil. I know Donna Cox from More Meadows always advocates mole hills for this if you're doing it on small areas. But otherwise, if you have scarified your soil and you've raked it out, then you can spread it more widely, either by hand or by using a spreader like this towed one. And if you've got animals, or in my case, if I've got children that I don't mind wandering past afterwards, they help to trample that seed into the soil. So that's most of the techniques. And I should just highlight that you can do that anywhere. Anyone can do this. Grasslands are fantastic in the sense that you can work on the size of a teacup through to the size of a whole landscape. And we've been doing this both in our rural areas, but also in Exeter, and we've been involved in Plymouth doing grassland restoration works. And obviously, a lot of these are using annuals to get to show, but we're increasingly going over to perennials and looking more like our native grasslands. So it's important to think that everyone can do this. Even if you've got a size of a doormat outside your house, you can recreate a small piece of grassland. And they all follow the same principle in terms of restoration. Last couple of slides just to show is, I just think about monitoring. It's going to take years for a grassland to settle. We're all impatient and want it done yesterday, and we want, having spent all this hard effort recreating it, to be the species-rich grassland that we imagined. But what happens is that it takes years, and you have massive fluctuations where one year you get a huge load of things like oxeye daisies, the next you might get some docks come in or something like that, and then you get a load of knapweed, a load of carrot, or whatever else might come up. We have to be patient. We have to monitor and watch what we've got. You probably need to add more seed as you go. Those original seedings won't be enough to get everything back. And many species of seed, their seed only lasts in the soil for a very short time. So just reapplying, but knowing what you need. You can also adapt your management. If you're seeing things that you're concerned about, you can just adapt your management to make sure that you're not getting things that you don't want in the grassland. So, just to finish up, yeah, so it'll take some effort to get back to recover the 97% of grasslands that we lost since the 1930s. Take even more to get back to anything like a natural state, and I don't suppose that's possible, perhaps somewhere in between the two. Grasslands are very adaptable. They're very resilient, and on the whole, they're very easy to restore. You can just leave a grassland to it if there's some seed nearby. So it's September time. A perfect time to start either planning for next year, or if you're already ready, going out and getting your seed and getting it onto the grassland. So I encourage you all to go out there and start restoring grasslands wherever you can. Right, that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. That was really interesting and really informative, and I love some of those pictures as well of some of the ones from the old days with the sickle, and the height of that the grass that they were cutting was amazing. Anyway, so we've got a few questions. So if anyone you want to add some questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little speech bubble. You can put your question in there, just type it in, and we'll get through as many as we can. So to kick off, just a few more. So we've had quite a few questions, which is first one which will kick off, which is when is the best time of year to sow wildflowers? Yeah,
that's a good question. You can generally you look at 2 times of year, either autumn or spring. I would say that the best time of year is any time from when the seed would naturally drop, so sometime in midsummer to late summer, through until, I think they used to say until the shortest day, so in December. And the reason for that is lots of our seed needs a prolonged period of cold to scarify the seed to help it to germinate. It doesn't necessarily need frost, which is lucky in some parts of Devon because we don't always get a lot of frost. So that's probably the best time to do it. But I would just say that spring sowing can be really useful, especially in places like in areas that are likely to get a lot of footfall, or where you don't want exposed soil for a long time. Then you can do a spring sowing. You might not get all of the species, but as I said before, you might be able to add them in later on if you can't get them to take.
Okay, that's great. Can you talk a little about the invasive species like blackberry and bracken dock?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I said about the harrowing causing problems is that especially where you've got established grasslands, and especially where it's near agricultural land, and especially where it's very improved agricultural land with lots of nutrients. Once you start to expose the soils or change the management, that's when you can get things like docks, nettles, thistles creeping in to grasslands. Now, it depends on your take on this, really. I'm a believer that when you look at that, you can learn something about it. It's probably a temporary alteration to the grassland, and it's the change in management that is causing those species to creep in, and maybe being patient, so long as it's not affecting neighbours or whatever, then they will probably diminish as the management of that grassland settles. But if it's the other thing is to learn from it and say, okay, what am I doing wrong that those are coming in? And it could be that you're regularly exposing more soil, maybe you're compacting soil, or maybe there's too much nutrients there. But these things do come in, and they can sometimes be prolific. And if they are, you do need to think about, we still have an Injurious Weeds Act, and we still have a requirement not to spread certain weeds. In terms of bracken, bracken is often a sign of where we've got acid ground, probably used to be woodland. We're going back hundreds or thousands of years, used to be woodland. And the increased nutrients in our systems means that bracken can be prolific. So you could argue that, do we look at woodlands on some of those sites? I wouldn't advocate that everywhere. It's sort of 50-50, but rolling that is probably the best way, breaking the stems to crush them to reduce their strength. You do that twice in the year in the summer months. I would avoid pesticides at all costs. We know that we've lost huge numbers of insects. Our Action for Insects campaign has been very busily shouting about that, and we know that doing that can have a massive deleterious impact both on the insects, but also on other species. You can have inadvertent consequences on other species that you're trying to get in there.
Okay. We've had another question, which is somebody who has wanting to know what they can do with the cuttings when they cut the meadow each year. It's too much for a compost heap, and they can't get a baler into the field. Any suggestions on what they could do with those cuttings?
Yeah, so there's various things. So I've seen all sorts of different solutions to that problem. First of all, obviously, yes, if you can compost it in piles, or certainly do that with some of it. Obviously, that's a huge benefit to anything that likes that warmth: grass snakes, hedgehogs, various amphibians, and invertebrates and the likes. So that it's still worth doing, even if you can't do it with all of it. The other thing you can do is create things like a bank across a field where you just basically you dedicate that bank to where you put your cuttings, and that will probably create a pretty nettly, thistly bank, but you could either plant woodland as a hedge across that, or you could just accept that that's what it is. Now, as long as it's not spreading those species, into your field or causing a problem, then that's a way. But I think the best way is if you can remove them from the site. So you could look at if you can't get a baler in, whether anyone would take it loose. Certainly some of my local horse folks take dumpy bags of cut hay, but they'll want it in length. So you do need to think about how you're cutting it, not sort of smashing it up. It is a challenge to get rid of it if you've got a big area, and you need to think about that, and you almost think of a management plan before you start along this route. The other option is to reduce the amount you cut each year and cut on rotation, so that you don't have so much to deal with, and accept that you're going to be cutting some and leaving some each year.
Okay. This is quite an interesting one. We have a person here who recently buried a pipeline through a field in restoration, and they've noticed that field pansies have appeared along the trench, nowhere else in the field, just along the trench. And the question is can you bring old seeds to the surface by ploughing new furrows through a field? And would this be a technique?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of, obviously the talk spoke about historic changes of the landscape, and we've altered the topsoil of our land hugely. But actually, when we do these things like trenches and roads and things like that, we tend to go right down to the subsoil and sometimes below. Now, some seed lasts a very long time, and so we can expose it, and it might come up. But the other thing that you're doing is obviously you're creating quite a big area of exposed ground where seed from nearby might get into. So I think it's probably a mix of seed from the lower layers of topsoil and maybe the upper layers of the subsoil that have survived through, if it wasn't too old, or if you've got quite thin soils. Where I live down South Devon, like I said before, and we have very thin soils there. You might just have a few inches of topsoil, and it's quite easy to expose it. And actually those soils might have they might come and go over regularly. And so you might think that's a very old soil, but it might actually be that it's come and gone much more quickly and more recently than you think. So you can expose them, but yes, quite often it's just pioneer species will come in, and that's where you get these sort of arable weed species coming in.
Okay.
The other thing, sorry, I would just say one other thing, which is that digging a trench exposes a load of soil which is maybe not as nutrient rich, so you might have buried the nutrient rich soil. So what you've got is very, very nutrient poor soil at the surface, and that means that those species that are reliant on fewer nutrients, which a lot of those are, will stand a chance. They might not survive for very long if the surrounding land is still nutrient rich, but they will survive for a little while.
Okay, we're running out of time now, so this will have to be the last question. We do have quite a few questions, so I'm really sorry if we haven't been able to get to your question. What we might do actually, Ed, is put together maybe a little blog and answer some of these other questions that are part of that, because I am aware there's quite a few that we're just not going to have the time to get to. So we'll finish. So this will be the last question, which is what species do you recommend to plant in gardens? So wildflowers that can be added as plug plants and also blend or be part of a garden border.
Yeah, so we get asked this quite a lot for verges, grasslands, places in urban areas, but also, you know, sort of in rural areas where there's managed land. So the first thing to think about is how is your grass going to be managed? If it's going to be mown, if you can raise the mower just by even just a few millimeters, then many species will survive in that. And you see lots of mown grasslands with, you know, bird's foot trefoil, yarrow, red clover, what else, even oxeye daisies, lady's bedstraw, those sorts of things that will quite happily tolerate being mown reasonably tight. If you've got areas where you can leave longer, then to be honest, you're into the whole gamut of any species rich mix. And it really does depend on what you're doing with the garden around it. If you can reduce the nutrients down, because obviously lots of gardens, we love putting manure on our gardens and enriching them. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what most of our wildflowers need. So if you can strip the nutrients out or choose an area which is pretty sparse already, then put in a regular mix of either, depending on your soil type, something that fits with your soil type. And look at, you know, getting things like knapweeds and scabious and betony and things of that sort in there. These are really good pollinator species. The umbellifers, those things like carrots and cow parsley are really great for night flying insects. Anything that's white quite often will be really good. Even things like red campion and foxglove, really valuable for pollinators, but also night flying insects. So those species that I think bring multiple benefits, but also survive in different situations, I would try and get a nice mix of them into your garden.
Thank you. And thank you, Ed. That was really excellent talk. Really, really enjoyed that, and got lots of great tips as well. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, everyone, for coming along and listening. Just a couple of things just before you go. There is, Ed did mention our Action for Insects campaign. There is quite a lot of free resources that is part of that campaign. So again, if you go onto our website and look for Action for Insects, you can sign up for that, and they have very good guides, either one for your garden or also for actions that you can take as a community. So I do recommend that you have a look at that and sign up to that campaign and claim that your free either guide for gardening, which will help create spaces for insects, as well as encourage wildlife to your garden, and also as part of the community. And one last shameless plug again for membership. Do please consider joining us as a member if you're not already. Again, details are on our website. Every membership makes a real difference to us, so please consider that if you are not already a member. Finally, our next talk is on the 17th of September, and this one will be about our beavers, our river otter beavers. So again, details on the website, and we hope to see you with that one. Thanks ever so much for coming. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.